Tourette's podcast is not a medical advice show. It's a show about experiences. In the course of that, we may talk about medications or therapies or stories from the doctor's office, but don't mistake any of that for medical advice or direction. It's not. Get that only from people or places licensed or certified to give it, not from a massively fun and action-packed podcast about our life experiences. Such as?
It gave me the mindset of, okay, if I do want to succeed with Tourette, and I do want to succeed and I will succeed with Tourette, I may have to work a little bit harder than the next person who is roughly the same but does not share the condition. And so I adapted that mentality of, I'm just going to work harder and I'm going to work harder. And if it takes me longer, it takes me longer, but I'm going to work harder. Sometimes it means I get a little bit less sleep than I would like. But what it's done for me is I think allowed me to overcome a lot of obstacles in a difficult field.
This is Tourette's podcast, made possible with support of the Tourette Association of America and part of the Geeks Rising Network. Fantastic episode today. I'll set up the details in just a minute, but so good. We've got an astrophysicist on the call today. Exoplanets and Tourette syndrome, that's the theme today. This is going to be good. Otherwise, I'm continuing my apology tour for being too positive on this podcast. Just kidding, kind of. I did get another reminder this past week of how difficult it can be to have a diagnosis like this. I mean, and there was a positive spin I'm going to throw on this. I told you an episode or two ago that I had a new tic that I absolutely cannot stand. And in saying that, I have to note that it's not a painful tic. Like, it doesn't drag me down too far. It doesn't take me out of the game. So I guess I'm being a little bit of a, dramatic, but it's a vocal tic that just sounds ridiculous. Like, anyone who hears me make this sound in public would turn their heads and raise their eyebrows. And I don't do it all the time, but its existence, the existence of this tic is annoying, knowing that, 5 seconds from now it could happen. Well, we always talk about how Tourette is more than just tics. The iceberg graphic. Often people with TS or TS people or Touretters or whatever way you'd like to be addressed. This community also has things that I deal with, like depression and anxiety. We've talked about panic attacks on this show, many times before. How absolutely terrible everything is when you're experiencing one. So I've been working out of my home studio since the pandemic began. Before that, my day-to-day was doing this kind of work in an office setting. So my day job is multimedia. So that's photography, videography, podcasting, things like that. But it's in an organization of well beyond 100 people. And we've all, or most of us have been working from home, not in the office. But like a lot of other offices and headquarters, leadership made the decision just recently to bring us back into the office. So we had a big reunion day kind of thing, I guess you could say. It was on the 15th of July. And while I do love working from home, it just feels better to me. I can be more productive and, I love that. But I was kind of excited to get back in there to the office. There's a team of people I work with, like a division of the company, and they're all solid and cool and supportive people. They know about Tourette. They make me feel very comfortable. And I was excited to see them, So the day begins at 7:30 a.m. with a catered breakfast. And I live in the American South. So if we're talking breakfast, we're talking grits, which I love, and, just a Southern breakfast. So I get breakfast, and then I go to hang out with our graphic design and communications folks, Johnny and Ashley and Jack and their names. And I have a great time catching up with them in person. The weird awkward potency now that people have in person versus being on a screen. There was something about that. Like, I'm going to use the word energy in a colloquial sense here, but there's a different energy seeing all these people in person versus on Zoom calls. And this energy is all over the place on that morning, on the 15th, when we're all going back to the office for the first time. The hallways are loud, not in a bad way. It's just people, they're happy to see one another and catch up and joke around, and just people ribbing each other in good faith. Something I'm not very good at, but I enjoy it when I see it. So I eventually go into my own office, like my own room, and I close the door. I don't know, this is where it started, but this nervous chill that I didn't expect starts to creep in, and it's starting to grow, and I know it's about to happen. I don't know what specifically triggers it, what variable or set of variables added up to what's about to amount to a panic attack. It's coming. I'm going up that steep roller coaster that I don't want to be on, but I feel powerless to do anything about it. And once I go over the edge, I don't know how fast it's going to go. I don't know where we're going. My hands begin to go numb. My lips begin to go numb. I know if I start talking, it's going to come out in this sort of sobby sounding voice. And I know if someone comes into my office, they're going to get freaked out because I look like I just got some really bad news or something. And then dreading that that's going to anchor the person in place to where they feel the need to start asking me questions or doling out platitudes like, hey, it's not all that bad. And this is all perfectly nice. Like, people care for each other. And if someone saw me in a position like that, they would be concerned. But this is all like a tornado in my head of scenarios and what might happen and who's going to think what and what that's going to lead to. And I can't leave because people are in the hallway and they'll see me and they'll ask questions. And I just don't want to leave that back there. I thought about hiding under my desk so the office looked empty and no one would think to come in and say hi. But what if someone did come in for some other reason? Then what? Seeing me under my desk, like what's that going to do? And I know at this point I have to start lining up the coping and grounding exercises right now, or this is going to be a runaway train for a good while, this panic attack. It's going to be bad no matter what. I'm going to feel it. It's a panic attack. But if you recall, or maybe you're new to the podcast and haven't heard this one, but episode 0 of season 5 is titled, I Checked Myself In. And it's an episode all about my experience voluntarily checking myself into and spending roughly a month with a psychiatric hospital to really try to get a handle on my depression and anxiety and certain life circumstances and trying to do it without the stigma of I'm damaged and I have to check myself into this place. And I wanted the courage to address things because I didn't have it. And that's where I learned the coping and grounding mechanisms that worked for me or worked enough. And so it was my luck that earlier when I got breakfast from the break room, I made the nonsensical move of getting a cold carbonated beverage from the break room fridge. Something I had no reason to be drinking that early, soda for breakfast. Anyway, it was still cold and unopened and sitting on my desk. So I pick it up and I put it against my cheek just to kind of rattle myself, give myself a new feeling, something else for my brain to think about for a sec. I start massaging my hands a bit and putting pressure in different places, even though, my hands kind of feel numb. But I was also frozen in my chair at this point. Like I wasn't going to get up. It took a little bit to be able to get up and walk around. But the biggest thing I did was think about the episode we did with Dr. John Walkup a while back. I think it was a couple seasons ago, about what's happening in the brain when we feel anxiety. Starting to put it in a scientific context. Besides it just being this monstrous feeling, what's the science? Put it behind glass, put my anxiety in a jar with a stick and a leaf to make a Mitch Hedberg joke. Basically my own anxiety and panic, making that observable to me, to myself, like I'm on the outside looking at it. It's a scientific observation. And so I got to say, how I'm describing this right now is the clean, concise version. So I don't want you to think that this was some like easy linear process of figuring out how to get out of a panic attack. And I didn't get out of it, but what I did was to try to think about what's next. I know this is a panic attack. And even though it feels like the most doom kind of thing in the world, I know it's not going to kill me or physically injure me. Not it by itself. I am near to my work team and they know what's up. They understand. So if I need to call one of them, I can feel comfortable doing that. And then I texted 3 or 4 of my friends who are, close and understand this stuff. So that adds them to the context of support, and they're texting me back and they're being awesome about it. And yeah, there was definitely a time where I would be so inside my own panic that I wouldn't even think about the outside resources I had. Or maybe I was ashamed or didn't want people to think I was just asking for attention or being dramatic or whatever people say. But my friends are texting me back and I was being predictive too. Like, okay, so now I'm in the stage, like this stage of panic. And usually here's what comes next. Here's how long it lasts and so on. So like I'm auditing and mapping out my own ways with panic attacks, which is way more difficult and messy than I'm making it sound here. Like sometimes I picture if I'm going through scenarios and things I'm trying to, I guess, process in my head, it's almost like someone taking a phone book and just like flipping through the pages really fast. And you have all these options of information, but it's all a mess. Like that's still happening in my head. But the next day, let me just skip ahead to the next day. even though I was still drained from this panic attack, and yeah, I was eventually, okay, so let's go back to the panic attack day. I was able to fake a cell phone call and open up my office door and beeline for the elevators so I could get out of there. Oh, and by the way, the first time I tried to walk toward the elevators, one of my coworkers, I think it was a coworker, it was someone who I hadn't met yet, said, "Hey, mind if I ride down with you?" Like referring to the elevator. And I literally just turned around and walked the other way. That's how I was dealing. And I'm going to apologize to her when I see her next because she didn't know what was happening, assuming I see her again. But I did a lap around the floor of the building to kind of take my chances again. And then I was able to ride my own elevator down, got to the parking deck, sat in my car, and just really started to let it all out. I felt safe in my car. It was fine. I was out of the office and it was just me. And staying there, keeping my people updated until I felt okay to drive. And a good amount of time has passed at this point. I think this started at maybe like 8 or 8:30 in the morning. And by this point, it was around noon. So I feel safe enough to drive and process everything I need to process to drive. I get home, fall onto my bed. The cats join me and I just pass out and just sleep really hard. The next day, I'm really drained and feeling it, but I'm also feeling good about how all of that went. And again, this just works for me. I'm not saying this is going to work for you, doing everything I just described, but comparing the intensity of that panic attack and how it could have potentially gone had I not done those things to preserve myself and let trusted friends know about it so I'm not alone with it. I've had less severe panic attacks in sensation that have had worse outcomes than this one because I didn't know what to do. So I was stoked in my own way over how I got through it. But it was another reminder that all this stuff is still here for me. It's not fun. Still, I'm managing it better with self-awareness I didn't have a few years ago. Didn't even have 2 years ago. And that's reassuring to me. I don't know, not clean or straightforward in any way. And this is just the Cliff's Notes version of what happened. But I guess this is kind of my new bookmark, The Office, like feeling fine being there. I don't want to work from home forever. I want to get back in there and try to enjoy the things that I actually do enjoy about being in the office. I know I'm not the only one who's had this kind of story. If you want to share yours, I'll absolutely read it. I would love to. Use the contact form at tourettespodcast.com. Before we get to the great conversation we had this week, I want to put out the results of a small sample poll that Sophia put up in the Tourette's Podcast discussion group. This poll follows a conversation that she and I had about vocal tics and how they feel and what the mechanics are. So she put up a poll, and this was the question. When you have vocal tics, what is it that satisfies this urge? That's the question. When you have vocal tics, what is it that satisfies that urge? The smallest percentage of respondents, so let's go in reverse order. The smallest percentage of respondents said it's the volume and pitch of the sound that satisfies that vocal tic urge. Twice as many respondents said it's the actual sound that's produced when they do a vocal tic. But far and away, the biggest group of respondents said it's the action of making that sound. Like what you got to do or how it feels. And that's what I relate to most. Like I'm with this majority, how it actually feels when I'm vocal ticking. Same as when I'm motor ticking. I think the premonitory urge, which I don't always get anyway, but the premonitory urge I think does feel different with a vocal tic, but it might be from the extra nervousness that I get personally with the vocal tics that I have. So people from the discussion group went into the comments to elaborate on their answer. And I want to read a couple. Helen says, that took some thinking about. I have a tic that involves a movement in my throat and a kind of sound that I have to do both to satisfy the urge. But that made me wonder, is what I assumed was a vocal tic actually a vocal tic and a motor tic combined? So that's a question from Helen. And I have a very similar tic, and you might too. Rena says, I'm not sure I can separate them out. And when I can, it's different depending on the tic. The throaty ones, it's the feeling. The soundy ones, it's the sound. But also the feeling? And that's from Rena. Tara says, I have one tic that I've had pretty much as long as I can remember. I'm 28 years old. It started more as a motor tic, touching my upper lip to my nose. That's definitely a familiar tic for me. But has grown into a vocal tic since I have to make a very distinct and specific sound now when I do it. If I don't make that specific sound when I tic, I repeat it until I do. I realize this could also be my OCD creeping in, but interesting how this one tic has sort of evolved over my lifetime. That's from Tara. Elizabeth McDonald, the top-notch artist and extremely cool Elizabeth McDonald, designer of the Tourette's podcast logo, said, sometimes the words I tic can come out quiet, barely spoken, and the urge will go away, but not always. But my whistling tic, if it isn't pitch perfect, it has to go on until it is. And Haley, succinctly says, it's all of the above for me. I have to be able to hear it and feel it correctly. Thanks to everyone who gave perspective on that. This poll is just kind of a floating thing right now in the discussion group, so feel free to weigh in and add context in the comments. I think Sophia and I are going to do more of this, just little questions to see how you feel about them. Things we wonder about. Like life on other planets. How's that for a segue to our guest this week? This one was almost random. I was in the podcast studio and had an hour to kill. And so I just put out on social media, like, hey, anybody available? Anybody want to do an episode? And the first person I heard from was this guy, Mark. And this was like magic because he was so great to talk to. Just a really good tone and attitude and sense of self. And what I didn't know until we started talking, I think, is that he's an astrophysicist, which sent my brain all over the place with questions about the universe that I didn't ask because we were talking, of course, about Tourette, but we still get into space and astrophysics and his core focus, which I think is really exciting, exoplanets. If you don't know what that means, Mark explains.
So, of course, thanks again, Ben. We are totally live. Yeah, there's been no planning involved here. So this is fun, but this is exactly how I'd want to do it. So my name is Mark. I'm from Philadelphia. That's where I live. I was born and raised just over the river in South Jersey. And I'm a graduate student of astrophysics right now. And I have Tourette syndrome and have dealt with tics since basically as long as I can remember. Since preschool was the first time that I had my first tic. And it's been a long, relatively isolating battle for me, and one that I've really only kind of come to be more open about in the last year or two. So it's very recent to me. There aren't a lot of people in my world that know about this. Right. It's sort of everything else about me that people know, and this is the thing that people don't know. So this is by far, I'd say, the biggest step that I've taken towards kind of coming out about having Tourette syndrome to other people, or just opening up about this to the world. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's awesome that you're doing this, and I'm glad that we just can, kind of essentially randomly intersected almost. It was a request, but so it's not like we just ran into each other in public. But this is I'm really grateful for this. So you said a lot of stuff that I'm curiously interested in, especially the astrophysics part. Do you have an origin story with that, or how'd you get started in interest like astrophysics? I'm a first generation bachelor's college graduate student in my bachelor's student in my family, and first generation graduate student as well. So it's not something that I picked up really from anybody in my family. Sometimes I'll still get people in my family that are asking, "Oh, what do you do again? What are you studying?" I don't really know. So it's a little confusing to some people, but I study exoplanets, and it's a very cliche thing where when I grew up, I was very fascinated with the night sky, and I loved looking up, and I always loved the middle of the night when things were still and things were quiet, things were peaceful, it was dark, and you just saw everything that was above, that was out there, and it just let your mind wander. And I think it just, that paired with, I was really fortunate to have always had a good relationship with math and science. And so those things paired together, I think, really led me to this field. And it's something that really excites me and I'm very passionate about. That's interesting because I'm, I guess, quote unquote, the other side of the brain where I'm not very good at math. I'm very interested in science from, I guess, kind of like a critical thinking standpoint and, what counts as science and how do we get to what we know and all of that. That's like a huge interest point for me. But I've always been more of a, on the creative side of things. My dad, he was a civil engineer. So he had that side of the brain. My mom, I think I just kind of took after her because she was the arts, mm-hmm. type person. But from that led me to photography.
which does have a bit of math involved just in terms of, guessing your exposure, and
Absolutely.
it's made easier by the cameras they make nowadays. But one thing I really do like is night sky photography, where
Yeah.
you just leave the shutter open for like 15 to 30 seconds and just let it suck in all the light that it can. And then you have that's where you get those, Milky Way photos from that have the bands of the Milky Way. And I remember seeing those pictures in like National Geographic or something when I was little. I was like, wow, where can you go to see that in person? And I thought you could just, go to some part of the United States and just like see the sky lit up with the bands of the Milky Way. And maybe some places you can, but it's usually the photography that kind of gets you there. And
Absolutely.
yeah, with a lot of the images, and they're kind of jazzed up, but just when I finally did that and took my first night sky shot where you can see just like a zillion stars, that was mind blowing because I couldn't see it with my naked eye. But the second I was able to capture it with my camera, you walk away with a completely different picture of what you're walking beneath. It was so neat.
It's completely breathtaking. I agree. And there is so much, there's so much astrophysics in photography. There's so much photography in astrophysics. So
yeah,
those things pair well. And I love going out myself with a little telescope, and I'll usually do it with my iPhone. I'm not very good of a photographer myself, but I love to capture some pictures of the moon or pictures of Jupiter and some other planets and some bright stars and constellations and clusters and things like that. So it's something I enjoy as well. That's really cool that you do that.
It's really, I mean, and this may be the story for everybody on Earth. I'm not sure, but there is something about kind of getting lost in that and kind of dissociating from your problems, I think, in a personally therapeutic way. Is there any part of your Tourette or your experience with it that interacts with your interest in space or astrophysics as a discipline? Or
it's such a great question, and it is something that I do think about sometimes. Just as I was explaining, I guess sort of where the allure with space and astrophysics came from when I was growing up, about looking at the night sky, and finding that that serenity sometimes. I often wonder if it could have been the case that much of my days were clouded with such busyness, with tics, and such stress and such worry that people might see me, or that I was kind of shielding myself from the outside world by blocking all of these things in and keeping them all up, by being out in the middle of the night, and by imagining just how small we were. It kind of made my tics and my Tourette seem a little bit insignificant, but in the best way possible. That it was okay, that this was just a minor problem, and I could sort of be alone in that time and have that space to myself to, as you say, get lost in all of that and just let my mind sort of be free and have that sort of peace that I would find very difficult to obtain otherwise throughout the day.
I agree with what you said about, you can see the universe, and when you sort of overlay it on, one of our daily problems or things that we stress about, and just how insignificant that seems in comparison with the big picture, that I agree with that. Sometimes I do it in I think a personally, I don't know, like a comedic way, where there is something I need to worry about, or, something I need to get done, or bills I need to pay, or something like that. I'm like, you think about Jupiter or something, like,
right.
None of this matters in the grand scheme. And, but in a positive way, it almost, I mean, I pay my bills, everybody, but it almost like it takes the edge off of things sometimes. And I have totally thought about that in relation with not just Tourette, but I think anything I deal with.
It's a very grounding and humbling experience, I think, to put yourself in the frame of, not just society, not just Earth, but as silly as it may sound, or as over grandiose as it may sound, the universe, and to just consider that, things will be okay. It is day to day. Just take it one problem at a time, and at the end of the day, things are going to be just fine. The universe will move on.
You mentioned that this is it's kind of new for you to be talking openly about this, and, especially, I guess, in a level of depth, to where the public can hear it. I guess earlier on in your life, was that a conscious decision to kind of hold it down, or was it something you kind of discovered how to talk about much later in life, or, what's your background with that?
I was always just very fearful of what people might think of me.
Yeah.
That they may cast judgment, that it may make me lose friends. And so it was just my own decision. I didn't see people day to day that would do things like me, And so I didn't want to bring that extra attention to me. I was just very worried about what was wrong with me. I think it took me a while to understand that Tourette syndrome is not necessarily a very common thing, but that it is a very, it can be an accepted thing, and it doesn't have to be something I have to grow up being afraid about. And so I do worry about the future children and other children now that have to go through that same experience where they feel like they aren't allowed to open up and aren't allowed to be themselves, because that's certainly how I felt, that I just couldn't open up, or some consequence may happen to me, which sounds a little bit unfortunate to say out loud, but it was definitely a real feeling.
No, I was there too. I mean, it was like my worst nightmare that the cool people at school found out that I had Tourette, or the bullies, or whoever it was, anybody I needed to stay on the good side of. And you did kind of hit on this a little bit, but could you talk a little bit more about your decision to maybe kind of open up with it, and the first people you chose to tell? Or
well, so I'll start by saying, and Ben didn't ask me to say this, but your podcast was very pivotal in me wanting to come out more about this, because it allowed me to hear the people day to day that, there was nothing particularly special or unique. These were just people like you and me. These were just regular people living their lives that had regular jobs. They were regular students, they were regular kids, regular adults, and they had Tourette syndrome. And that made me feel really okay about the diagnosis that I had, is that there were other people just like me in all parts of the world that had this. And so in finding your podcast, that was actually one of the biggest ways that I was able to start to feel comfortable coming out. But to your other question,
wow, man, that's amazing to hear.
Yeah, so I am really grateful for you and for what you've done, and also, of course, for you having me on to have this conversation.
No, I'm glad we are. Really, I'm really glad we are.
But then growing up, as far as the people who did know, my parents knew it because they took me to my doctor's appointments, and they went to the neurologist with me, and they went to the pediatrician. So they were a part of that journey with me. But I still didn't really feel comfortable sharing all of the day-to-day struggles that I had. And it was at a point when I was growing up that I didn't necessarily realize how different my day-to-day life was from the same Mark that would be if he did not have Tourette's, because I didn't know any other way of going through a given day without having tics. And so I never really thought to bring that up to them, or to say, hey, this was a challenging day, because I was having a lot of facial stress, where I was putting a lot of tension in my stomach that now I'm having all these problems with. So I didn't talk about it to them a lot growing up, but they were aware of it.
Yeah.
And then it really, and there are people here and there, but as far as meaningful relationships in my life that I've been able to share this diagnosis with, it has not really been until the last 12 to 18 months, I think, that I've started to tell my grandparents, for instance, my best friend, for instance, my girlfriend of a few years now was also very instrumental in helping me to feel more comfortable about this. And so she's known for a long time. But
that's awesome.
Otherwise, it's a relatively small circle. And now I'm happy to include you in that circle as well as anybody who's listening.
Man, that's amazing. So how recently?
I think COVID helped a little bit for one reason or another. So I would probably say the last year, probably around April or May of last year, is when I really sat down and I thought, you know what, I'm not letting this be a secret from the people that mean something to me in my life. And so I started to plan these phone calls. I would sit down and I would say to the other person, you're a really important person in my life, and it's just become the right time for me to tell you this fact about me. And it doesn't change anything about who I am. It doesn't change our relationship, but it's just the right time for me to tell you that this is important for you to know about me. And this all happened in the last 12 months.
Wow. That's what you said about, it doesn't change anything about me. I mean, that's I didn't say that, and I kind of wish I had, because I think in a couple cases, I did kind of sense people carrying themselves a little bit differently around me, or maybe kind of being a little bit more don't know, like sensitive, I guess. I'm not really sure how to say it, but you could tell something was a little bit different in how they were addressing me shortly after it came up in conversation. And it's amazing how that can kind of bias people even after they've already known you for a while and know the kind of person you are. And that was still a fear of mine, is that if I tell my bosses, are they going to be like, I wish we had known this back in the day, we wouldn't have hired him because he's a liability, and they didn't say that at all. They're amazing employers, but that fear existed because of that, I think.
I share that too. There is a lot of anxiety around it. You don't want them to think that you're now working on some sort of a crutch around them, or that they need to be treating you differently. And so you almost feel a little self-conscious about it. I think that you don't want to make them feel as if they need to start changing something because they have this new piece of information about you. But
yeah, that's true. That was another thing that I think, I never did the thing of bringing it up in a job interview. I've been in the same position since, I don't know, like 5 years or something like that. But, and I've come out with this group of employees, bosses, all that, and they were cool and understanding, but it was a fear. Even if I wasn't going to bring it up in a job interview, it was still a fear that if they did somehow corner me and they found out, I mean, it's kind of an absurd thought, but just say hypothetically they found out, would they view me as a liability? Would they view me as something where kind of like what you're saying, like where they're going to have to treat me differently in a way that's going to hurt their pocketbook or something? Or do they have new rules to follow around me? And I've always worried that consideration might sway them the other way. If there's another applicant and we're neck and neck, that's the thing that's going to get me disqualified. Yeah. Like that's the kind of thing I always freaked out about. Yes,
I completely have the same feeling about that, which is so sad to feel. Why should that make it any less good of a chance that you're able to get a job or to land some position or to form some relationship? But it's a very real feeling that is.
And, not to say people with Tourette are better than anybody else, but, there are some advantages too. There's things that, might sound trivial, but I think do matter when it comes to learning a discipline, when it comes to, kind of mastering a topic. A lot of people I talk to on here, when they kind of latch on to a subject or, an interest point, it's like cannonballing into it and really, kind of learning all the bits and pieces and advanced language and all that. So you can kind of be a completist with it. And and I'm not saying that's like directly a Tourette syndrome thing. There's a lot of people who do that, but a lot of people I've talked to on this podcast do exactly that with a specific thing, a craft or whatever it is. Did you find yourself doing anything like that when it came to absorbing astronomy or in physics and when you were really kind of getting into that as an interest point?
What does come to mind for me, because you are right that some people you'll hear, they take up music and they are just, they're phenomenal. And I dabble in music, but I'm nowhere near enough to call myself a musician. But they take up a hobby, they take up a specific task or a craft, as you said, and they run all the way with it. For me, I think what it did the most is that it gave me the mindset of, okay, if I do want to succeed with Tourette, and I do want to succeed, and I will succeed with Tourette, then I may have to work a little bit harder than the next person who is roughly the same but does not share the condition. Just because it takes time out of the day to do the tics and to think about the tics and all of it that comes with it. And so I adapted that mentality of, okay, I'm just going to work harder, and I'm going to work harder. And if it takes me longer, it takes me longer, but I'm going to work harder.
Yeah.
And that was something that sometimes it means I get a little bit less sleep than I would like. But what it's done for me is, I think, allowed me to overcome a lot of obstacles in the field that I'm in the different schools that I've been through, and to just succeed and to thrive in a difficult field, and just by being able to again have that mentality of, I'll just work really hard and as hard as I possibly can. So it's given me that.
Have you had any thoughts about the kind of mindset and mentality and all that, and acceptance within the because that seems like an open-minded kind of community to me, almost by necessity.
Yeah, it is. It is, I think, a relatively progressive field in the sense of accepting people for who they are and accepting people for pre-existing conditions that they may have, accepting people for any which reason, because I think there is a lot of open-mindedness that you have to have as a scientist, and that's absolutely critical when you're working with the people who are scientists, your fellow scientists, that you have an open mind towards them and towards their backgrounds.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, in my case, I haven't directly met anybody in my sort of academic community that has Tourette syndrome, or really even that knows about my condition very well. So that's certainly something that I think would be really cool to be able to share, to have people in this field that I was able to work with and speak with that shared this diagnosis. But it's just not something I found yet.
Yeah. Well, and even people who were interested in this field, who were not necessarily at university level, or not at career level, but a teenager who might be really earnestly interested in a topic like this. I mean, it's just kind of cool to it creates these little sub communities, and I think that's kind of a fun thing, because you can kind of I don't know. In my case, I've learned new things about myself based on if we rounded up all these people who are into photography, for example, a lot of us would have the same story.
Sure.
Tourettic photographers and what it does for us and all of that. So it just, I think it's really motivating for other people to hear it when they're into it as well. And I think it's kind of, it's just, you have kind of like a clique or a group at that point. And plus the precedent is set. Are you at professional level with it, or is it is that synonymous with being a graduate, or what do you do?
Right now, I'm working towards my PhD, so I'm doing research for my university, working towards my doctorate degree, and then afterwards, I will effectively be a professional in the field. But at this point, I'm basically doing the work of a professional, but at a graduate student level. So every day I'm learning, and every day I'm growing, and I am still a student at the end of the day. But it's between your typical undergraduate bachelor's degree of education and an official sort of professional environment in the field.
Yeah.
Title and all that.
Is there any part of the job that you find particularly soothing? Is it just looking through a telescope or anything like that kind of hits that part that I think wants to be satisfied if you have something like Tourette syndrome? Because my tics go away, for example, when I'm really plugged in and I'm in the zone.
Yeah, that is a really good question, and something you've touched, that you've touched upon in the last few minutes that I keep thinking about in the back of my mind is, and it is so true, is that even though this is a Tourette podcast, I think you briefly mentioned without saying that, and people listening, maybe they have what we may call sister diagnoses, whether it's maybe on the autism spectrum or some form of Asperger's or severe ADHD, ADD. I think there are a lot of cases of people that listening, and I've heard people come on that also have other symptoms and different diagnoses that really take a lot away from hearing people talk about things on this podcast. And so I think that's just such a good point. But as far as things that are relatively soothing about the day-to-day, unfortunately, I don't get to look through a telescope as often as I would like. A lot of it is sitting behind a computer.
That was my next question. Yeah, is this like, that's the picture that comes to mind for everybody. You're at the observatory, but just there's the running numbers part of it too. Yeah,
I mean, it sounds like such a great job, and it is, and it's very cool, and there are a lot of really neat things that I've been able to learn. But a lot of the last year during COVID, I was sitting on my couch with a laptop doing astrophysics. So you don't necessarily need to be out there on the telescopes as much as I would like to.
The Tourette Association of America is the premier nonprofit working to raise awareness, advance research, and provide ongoing support to those with Tourette syndrome or tic disorder. With a network of over 130 chapters, support groups, and centers of excellence, the TAA engages with communities across the nation in an effort to provide tools, webinars, workshops, and support for all seeking assistance. As a primary sponsor of Tourette's podcast, the TAA supports the authentic conversations showcasing the diverse representation of the TS community. To learn more, visit tourette.org, TOURETTE.org.
What about in personal life? Is there anything that gives you kind of a reprieve? I mean, do you feel like you need to do that with your tics?
One thing I do enjoy doing that does settle the tics a little bit is playing music. I mentioned that I dabbled a little bit. I have a ukulele. I have a couple
nice.
of guitars and a small keyboard that I'll just play a little bit. I'll play chords and look those up. And when I do that, it will help me to it just gives you that sense of focus that I think we've already discussed a little bit, that when you are concentrating on something, it can be a little bit easier to forget about doing certain tics or executing certain motions, using certain sounds. So music is something that a little bit, it's purely recreational, but
sure,
it's a comforting exercise for me to do.
Have you had to medicate or anything like that? You have a really positive attitude about this, but that doesn't mean that there aren't times where you have to, kind of do the difficult labor to keep things at bay. Have you had to do that at any point in your life?
I appreciate that. I've done a few medications, and my mom might laugh at this because I feel like she would know, but I don't remember actually the name. Guanfacine, I think, sounds like a thing.
Yeah.
But I feel like I've tried them all, and I've only experienced the side effects and never really the so-called promise, the potential promise of a reduce in my tics. And so it's never really been worth it. And that's the thing too about seeking out different medications or treatments, that it almost feels like I've swung and missed so many times that is it really just worth the effort to keep like looking for a different solution, or is it at some point just easier to just manage my tics and just live sort of a more mindful day-to-day life about how I experience my Tourette syndrome. And recently I've just kind of thought maybe it's the latter, and that maybe there just isn't a solution. Maybe there doesn't need to be a solution, and maybe it's just going to be a lifelong sort of marathon about handling my tics better and learning to deal with them and learning to embrace them maybe.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I have tried some medication.
I've run through that of embracing certain tics. I mean, my longest running tic, a vocal tic that I've had since I was a kid, feels friendly to me. Like it doesn't, even when I do it in public, I mean, like, I still get embarrassed by certain tics, or I still feel the pressure to hold things in at certain times, when maybe I agree that it's appropriate that I not be loud at a certain, and even, I don't know, it's still an insecurity that I have with myself, but accepting your tics is a different kind of thing, because I don't know, it's made me feel a lot more calm about it with certain tics. Others I still have to negotiate with, and especially if they have a painful element to them.
Yeah.
But I have noticed, and maybe I'm just in my own head too much, but I have noticed that when I've felt more comfortable with certain tics, then I don't feel as inflamed with it. The other tics don't seem to bother me quite as much, or maybe, and I'm not going to say this in a scientific sense, but it's almost like the competing for my attention, these tics. It's almost like they all just kind of chill out a bit, because I pulled that lever down to be like, okay, like some of these tics are fine. I'm okay with it. And again, this could be me just totally just talking out of my feet, but.
No, I think there's a little bit of beauty in that, that almost just the act of accepting those tics and letting them exist as they are and as they come can, in some ways, maybe keep the others at bay, or maybe take your mind out of the equation and then just let the tics be the tics and not have sort of the anxiety that comes with them, or any of that.
Just thinking about challenges that Tourette still presents, or may still present for you. Is it primarily the social nervousness, or is it are there other aspects of Tourette or the things that come with it? We talked about the sister diagnoses.
Yeah. So sleeping is something that has sort of been on the forefront of my Tourette agenda in the last few months. Is that I've realized I have a really hard time falling asleep, and
Yeah.
I've started to kind of get in my head about it because I've never been able to sleep very well. But in starting to open up about this, I've started to realize, wait a minute, other people don't have a hard time falling asleep, and this is maybe something. Maybe there's something up with this, and maybe there's something I can do to remedy this. So I've tried things like melatonin, but I've now become very acutely aware that when I'm laying in bed at the end of the night, my tics are just kind of through the roof, and
Yeah.
I can't even relax. I mean, there's no real end to the day. You just tick until you fall asleep, and it's very distracting. It's very hard to get into that. I can't even count sheep straight because every third sheep I have to do a tick and start over. So it's a very distracting way to end the night.
Yeah, it is. There was a meme I saw a while back that I think was sort of meant for the ADHD audience, but it was a 70s like prog band Focus. And it's them like winding up a song with this like ridiculous vocal pattern and just getting like more intense as they go. And it was sort of, I think the pitch of the meme was, I need to wake up at 6 a.m. I better go to bed right now. That was like my brain. And then it's this band just winding up to start rocking out. And it just felt so accurate because I do the same thing. I can be really tired walking toward my bed and being convinced that I can lay down and the sleep train is going to come pretty soon. And then 3 hours later, I'm just like, God, where is it? It's like I'm
so much with me.
Yeah, it's like I'm tired. I think I know there are things I want to do, and now I'm starting to think of things I want to figure out. And the next day, this is the other thing too. I don't always feel I am taking, just like you said, I'm taking my sleep more seriously than I used to because I started reading more things about what happens, to the brain when you get older and certain things you really need to do for yourself if you want to be in prime condition. And sleep was definitely at the top of the list. And I do not measure up when it comes to sleep. And what scares me is I feel fine a lot of the time. I still have a lot of energy, even though I sleep, 4 hours a night. And I'm not saying it's justified, but yeah, it's something that's not on my mind quite as much. I think because of my experience, just being okay with it.
Well, then along the lines of sleep and sort of tangential issues with Tourette's, what not that it necessarily doesn't get talked about, but when people think of Tourette's, I think there's this idea that even if they realize it's not always extreme vocal tics, and it's not always things that people may sort of see on the surface or hear when they're out in public, it's the potential sleep deprivation. There are symptoms, or rather, there are effects that linger for me from my tics. Like I get acid reflux all the time from having this weird stomach muscle tic. I get sore eyes at the end of the day. My face gets numb. My arms carry all this tension from different muscle movements. And then there's the interference with simple activities like reading has always been such a struggle for me because mid-sentence I'll have the urge to do something and need to satisfy that quickly. And then I have to start the whole sentence over because I have no idea where I was. And typing too, if I need to stretch a finger to touch a certain key, well, then I have to backspace that key. And then I have to press hard on another key. And it's just this vicious cycle of, I can't even write an email sometimes because there's all these urges that just sort of overwhelm you.
Yeah. And that thing with reading you were talking about, that's another thing. I think we mentioned this a few episodes with Dan Zarin from Iceland. We both have the exact same problem with reading. And that's one that has tons of stigma on it. If, you have to say, or, hey, what's the last book you read? And it's like, I haven't read anything in 10 months because I haven't been able to, it's just, and then you're not going to go into a subject or a conversation about Tourette syndrome and how that prevents you from reading. It's like, there's a judgment issue. And maybe there's not a judgment issue and that's just what I'm scared of. But I love reading. Like I love literature. There were time periods where I would read, like 50 books a year, 55 books a year, like a book a week. And I felt amazing. I felt alert. I felt like I could form opinions and then that just, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, it just started falling apart and I would sit down to read and maybe it's ticking, but maybe it's also just my mind starts going somewhere else immediately when I start reading. And so there's that part, like my eyes are still looking at the words and going down as if I'm reading, but my brain is nowhere near it. And And yeah, that's been a big thing for me and something I hadn't even really thought to talk about until Dan brought it up a few episodes. And I definitely want to bring it up again because that's I feel like a lot of people go through that and maybe don't have a chance to have a conversation about it.
Well, sure, because I guess we feel that way because we live with it and it is the day to day, and you don't think that maybe, at least for me, it doesn't feel that it could be that other people experience this or, but I've really developed, similar to maybe it sounds like with you, this kind of poor association with reading is that I almost have this lack of desire to pick up a book because I know that it's going to cause some sort of a stress or some sort of a poor reaction.
Yeah, that's sad. That you could develop, even just seeing it, I don't know. I have a lot of books here. And there were certain genres I was really into or certain authors I was really into. And I've even thought, and this sounds like the most pathetic thought ever, and I realized in saying this that literacy, that there is a sense of privilege to this. But I remember thinking, I'm glad I read all these books back when. I'm glad I read this whole series, when I was, before whatever this is I'm experiencing now started. Mm-hmm. Because I really enjoyed those books and they've supplemented my life and I feel like they've affected my vocabulary and all of that. And I want to continue that. And I know I can do the audiobook thing too, but sometimes even I have a hard time with that. I don't know what it is. Like, I think I want the connection of seeing the words on the page, but I want to absorb it like an audiobook is playing to me.
I struggle with the audiobook sometimes too. On paper, it's, well, I guess literally not on paper, but it sounds like a good idea in theory, but it doesn't really work for me either. One thing that's crossed my mind is, I guess a few minutes back now, we were talking about sort of what other listeners maybe might get out of these conversations. And it brings me back to things that I looked for as a listener of this podcast. And you talked about maybe, not that there's necessarily anybody in the astrophysics community that I personally know, and maybe there are, maybe they do listen to this podcast, but that I know that have Tourette's, but that there could be kids listening to this podcast that, I feel like I've found myself in other people's stories that they've shared. And on the off chance that there's somebody listening that finds themselves in a story that I've shared, I feel like I would want to tell somebody that they shouldn't let Tourette syndrome be a reason to quit. Because a lot of times, in my experience, I felt that it would be so much easier to just quit because of my Tourette syndrome. And I've been told by a doctor even that it would be easier to just sort of not go after new adventures or seek new challenges because it would exacerbate my Tourette syndrome. And that stuck with me. And I think part of that has made me who I am a little bit. And so I would want to tell people, as an astrophysicist, I often challenge the saying that the sky is the limit because there's an entire universe to uncover. And I would want everybody with Tourette syndrome to know that they can also reach for the stars that are far beyond our sky. And to think that there could be kids, young adults, old adults who just want to find new meaning in their life that may be affected negatively by Tourette syndrome, and to think that they might not be able to achieve their dreams because of it.
Yeah.
Really stings me, and I would just, it just kills me to think that there may be people who, it almost makes me emotional, but to think that there could be people who would let Tourette syndrome, keep them from their dreams. And so I hope that is not the case for anybody. I think everybody wants to see themselves in in somebody else that may be their future self or a future version of themselves. And so just trying to find and plant those role models for people to be able to look up to in any facet of life can be a very big step for somebody.
For me, it was Jim Eisenreich when he was playing for the Kansas City Royals. I think that was the
name.
Yeah.
I know the name. Yeah.
He played for the Phillies too, and the Twins. And I remember meeting him at one of the Tourette conferences, and I'm like, man, this guy's like, wow. I was like kind of taken aback just by, someone got famous and they have Tourette syndrome. And that sort of, and it's funny, I use him as an example because I didn't become a professional baseball player, but he definitely, planted that seed of confidence when it comes to, oh, wow, this guy's like a major leaguer and I have his baseball cards at home, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you want to see somebody who's done it, and maybe it's not the same field, maybe it's not the same profession, whatever it may be, but you want to see somebody that has had success with, while also overcoming the problem that you're facing or the challenge that you're working against. So that's really cool, and I think that's so important to have those kinds of role models in your life.
What are your personal goals with astrophysics? And I mean, is there something you're working on? You said exoplanets, but is there kind of like an arc to this for you?
Yeah. So I think about exoplanets. I think about their stars, sort of one and the same in some sense. It's so scientifically, it's not. There are about 4,000 planets outside of our solar system that we know about, and that's very cool.
Mm-hmm. Exoplanets.
Exoplanets, yeah.
And what are they? Just put a definition on it.
Of course, yeah. So an exoplanet is a planet that is outside of our solar system. So we have 8 in our solar system: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus. Uranus and Neptune, rather. And but you look up and you see some thousands upon thousands of stars in the night sky, and there's no reason to think that those stars don't also have planets that may have Earths and Mercuries with maybe there's trees, maybe there's life, maybe there's not, maybe it's icy, maybe it's big, maybe it's hot or lava. But as it turns out, these stars do have planets, and there are many planets. And this is a very new field. The first planet was found just 25 plus years ago. So a personal goal and that's what an exoplanet is. So a planet outside of our solar system. But a personal goal for me would be to be a part of a discovery for a new planet. And it's a little bit ironic because since there are some 4,000 now, it's not necessarily interesting scientifically to just add on another planet to that number because it's not the first, it's not the second.
Still pretty cool.
Yeah, for the last 5 to 6 years since I've told myself that I wanted to do exoplanets, it's just sort of a personal milestone that at some point I'd love to be able to hit to be able to claim that I helped to discover a planet. So that's sort of a personal goal, but hopefully there are many scientific feats that I'm able to achieve in a career that I hope to stay in for the rest of my life.
This is a big topic of interest for me that I know virtually nothing about, even within the context of what we do know about the universe and physics and how things are put together. And trying to think of who, like Lawrence Krauss and trying to think of who else. Just there are a lot of people who are really good communicators with it, and that's another thing that I kind of get an impression from you. You communicate really clearly and simply, and I think that's also something that's very important for the sciences to when it comes to accessibility and not seeming so maybe daunting to people on the outside that this is a difficult profession, and it is, but opening doors and making it relatable to people is, I think, a huge skill. And I like the way you explain things. I feel like you have a definite command on that.
That's so wonderful to hear. You have no idea. So much of what I do pride myself on wanting to be able to give back to the non-science community, because I do believe that science is for everybody, and that's not how people are grown up to think. They don't.
Right.
As a kid, you don't think that maybe science might not be for you, but it should be accessible to everybody. So I do really enjoy public outreach. I've given a few public science talks on exoplanets, one of which is on YouTube. It's just something that I like to do just in my local community. It's not something that I branch out very much to do, but I appreciate you saying that, because it is something that I am passionate about doing and sharing.
Yeah, and you're exactly right when you said that science is not something that's the path to science. Mm-hmm. It's almost like my memories of it were, I think I had a different impression or a wrong impression of what science was and what it meant. I saw it more as just a school subject, and you learn words like chlorophyll, and you learn the biomes, and it's just kind of learning things that already exist, almost in a historic form. And so that didn't seem quite appealing to me. Had I been taught science as something where you can take what we know and find out all new things, with and you can test claims and do all kinds of things. We have the scientific method, and it's how we can kind of come to know ourselves better and learn new things. And I think had I learned that science is that versus you got to learn what's in this book, I would have had maybe even a different life. I don't know, because I'm a science junkie, but I'm on the completely other side of the field when it comes to practice.
And what people, I think, don't realize is that you're often taught that it's highly analytical. You must be very logical, very rational. While those things are true, for every bit of analytics that it does take to be a scientist, there is the same bit of creativity. And so people who grow up with that creative sense and not that I'm really naturally good at math and science, so I'll be a scientist. Well, you actually really need to be creative too. And so I think one thing that science is lacking a little bit, but starting to grow a little bit more into now, is that it's not attracting enough creative people. And I think if everybody was given a fair shot at succeeding in science, we'd be much better off as a field and as a community, because we are missing those creative minds. And so there really should be no reason why anybody interested in science should feel as though they can't contribute to it.
Thanks for listening. Thanks so much to Mark. That was awesome. It's fun. 9th episode of the season. And hey, wait, 9 planets. Hang on, is that still true? Oh man, please let that work out. Hold on, I gotta Google this. All right, that didn't work out. Okay, when I was in elementary school learning the planets there were 9 planets at that time. Yeah, that reclassification of Pluto means we have 8 planets, so 1 episode late on that. Okay, wait. Hear me out. Season 7, 8 planets, episode 9. There we go. 789. We did it. We'll be back with more thanks to the Tourette Association of America, the primary sponsor of Tourette's podcast. I talk with them all the time, and they're all in on airing real-life stories, giving people real-life context with Tourette syndrome, hence their support of this podcast, where we just talk without a script, have a real conversation, and see where it goes between 2 people who experience Tourette syndrome in our lives, directly or indirectly. And we have some more indirectly ahead. Thanks also, of course, to Geeks Rising. That's the fantastic podcast network that brings this show to a general listening audience. If you want to give individual support to the show in a small cup of coffee kind of way, you can do so at patreon.com/Tourette's podcast. Follow on the social channels and join up with the Tourette's podcast discussion group on Facebook, run by the amazing Sophia out in the UK. In the UK. I don't know why I say out in the UK. All right, I'll talk to you guys next time. This is Ben. And if you're still listening, my friend Ash had a poll question for me that I like because it kind of involves the brain and preference. Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. What do? Do you take the piece of bread and put the peanut butter on it and then put the jelly on the other side, like the other piece of bread, and then smash them together? Or do you do it all on like the same piece of bread? And when you're done, is that it? Or do you cut it? Do you cut it across? Do you do little triangles? This has nothing to do with anything, but I like it anyway. Tourette's podcast at gmail.com. Okay, I'll talk to you guys next week.